Some apostles worked quietly, but they changed the course of history. Now we're going to try and discover the apostles Philip, Bartholomew, Andrew, and Matthias. Apostles whose mission spread the message to new lands, ensuring continuity and strengthening the early congregations really through faithful service. See, when the name Philip comes up, who immediately comes to your mind? Yeah, it's Philip the evangelist, Acts chapter 8. However, this Philip was not the apostle Philip. The gospel accounts say very little about the apostle Philip, other than his interaction with Jesus in the Gospel of John. So when we speak of the 12, we often remember Peter and James and John. But today, we're going to turn to one whose quiet diligence really opened doors beyond Galilee. Philip of Bethsaida is known as a sort of connector of people to Jesus, of faith to action. And he reminds us that the gospel spread not by fame, but by faithful service. He appears most clearly in John's Gospel. He was from Bethsaida, the same town as Peter and Andrew. Tradition tells us it was a humble fishing village on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. Now, Philip likely knew Andrew and Peter before following Jesus, perhaps hearing of the whispers of John the Baptist and the coming Messiah. Now, in John chapter 1 and 43 to 46, Jesus finds Philip and says simply, "Follow me." Philip's first response is immediate and obedience. But his first act as a follower is quite striking. He goes and finds Nathanael, Bartholomew, and says, "We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law and the prophets also, Jesus of Nazareth." Here we see Philip as a bridge going from curiosity to conviction, from announcement into action. And the Gospels give little else of Philip during Jesus' ministry, but tradition and apocryphal accounts expand his story. He's often remembered for his practical mind, able to organize and mediate and connect those who really sought Jesus. Philip appears again in John chapter 6 and verses 5 through to 7, during the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus asks where they might buy bread for the crowd. And Philip responds with a sort of cautious realism. Verse 7 reads, 200 denarii would not buy enough bread for each of them to have just a small piece. Because 200 denarii is about 8 months' wages. It's quite a crowd. See, Philip is practical. He's grounded in the human reality of the moment, yet ready to follow Jesus' miraculous provision. See, later in John chapter 12, Greek seekers approach Philip with a question. "Sir, we wish to see Jesus." And Philip is again a connector. He brings them to Andrew, who brings them to Jesus, showing a sort of collaborative ministry mindset. Now, after the resurrection and ascension, Philip's story expands through early Christian writings. See, Eusebius records that Philip preached in Phrygia and in Hierapolis, that is in modern-day Turkey, and that his daughters were known as prophetesses, carrying on his faith through example. The Acts of Philip, a non-canonical work, describes his preaching in Asia Minor with miraculous healings and baptizing converts. Now, while these texts mix sort of history and legend, they do reflect the early community's memory of Philip as a man of courage and faith and practical wisdom. And of course, tradition also says that Philip was martyred in Hierapolis, bound to a cross and pierced with spears. See, his life reminds us of the quiet heroism in discipleship. See, unlike Peter's fiery sort of leadership or John's visionary intimacy, Philip worked in the spaces between, connecting, pointing, and facilitating. His daughters, mentioned by Eusebius, well, they suggest a family devoted to the early Christian mission, emphasizing faith as both personal and indeed communal. Philip also models obedience. See, he followed without question, served without seeking attention, and linked others to Jesus' message. So his legacy continues in the idea that the faithful service often creates the strongest bridges in the kingdom of God. From Philip, who connected hearts to Jesus, we now move on to Bartholomew or Nathanael. See, Philip was a sort of a bridge. Bartholomew, Nathanael, was the one who carried the message to distant lands. Jesus called him really an Israelite in whom there is no deceit. John chapter 1 and verse 47. We'll read that. See, when Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said of him, "Here is a true Israelite in whom there is no deceit." This really highlighting a rare spiritual clarity and a moral character. See, Nathanael, Bartholomew, may have been his given name. This apostle's story really emphasizes both discernment, courage, and indeed a willingness to follow Jesus even into unknown lands. He likely hailed from Cana in Galilee, the same town known for its wedding feast. We covered that, didn't we, in the last video? His first encounter with Jesus really is quite striking. See, when Philip tells him, "We have found the one Moses wrote about," Nathanael, Bartholomew, responds a bit skeptical. "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" he says. John chapter 1 and verse 46. Yet when Jesus speaks with Nathanael, verse 48, he asks him, "How do you know me?" Nathanael asked. And Jesus replied, "Well, before Philip called you, I saw you under the fig tree." "Rabbi," Nathanael answered, "you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." You see, his honesty, but also his spiritual insight became his defining traits. A man whose faith begins with sort of reasoned discernment and then it blossoms into devotion. See, after Pentecost, Bartholomew's mission spreads far and wide, far beyond Israel. Tradition and, of course, apocryphal texts place him in India, in Armenia, in Mesopotamia, in Arabia. And the Acts of Bartholomew, again non-canonical, paints a really vivid portrait of a man performing miracles, confronting pagan kings, and enduring persecution for the sake of the gospel. In Armenia, he's confronted by local authorities who really opposed his teachings. And Armenian church tradition even claims he was martyred by being flayed alive. A gruesome testament, really, to the dangers early apostles faced, and of course, their unyielding faith. Some scholars suggest Bartholomew, Nathanael, may have collaborated with Philip and Thomas in certain regions. In India, he is said to have converted thousands and healed the sick, highlighting really how the early apostles often travelled in sort of overlapping networks. See, these joint missions reinforced the gospel's reach into far lands, establishing the early Christian communities really in very challenging territories. Bartholomew was a man of discernment, one of boldness and indeed of courage. And so he embodies the faithful actions which were rooted in integrity. He listened, he evaluated, and then acted decisively. Qualities really that would serve him well as he sort of carried the gospel into distant lands. Because in multiple Christian traditions, he's really venerated, particularly in Armenia and India, where local churches claim lineage back to his ministry. See, his martyrdom, though harrowing, reinforces the apostolic message because the gospel often comes at great personal cost. See, Bartholomew's life reminds us that faith requires both discernment and action. And he shows that honesty in following God can lead to really extraordinary courage and that far-reaching impact of one's life can sort of ripple across continents and indeed centuries, as we are finding out today. See, from Bartholomew, whose honesty guided him across nations, we now will turn to Andrew, Peter's brother, the first called apostle. Andrew was Peter's older brother. He was among the earliest disciples of John the Baptist and one of the first to follow Jesus, John chapter 1, 35 through to 42. See, he combined zeal with initiative, spreading the message to regions really around the Black Sea and Achaia, leaving a legacy that echoes both in Orthodox and Western Christendom alike. See, Andrew's role in the gospel is really understated, but it is pivotal. See, he brings Peter to Jesus, introduces others, and is often the first one to act. Now, he was from Bethsaida, like Philip, Peter, and his brother John. A fisherman by trade, he likely spent long hours on the Sea of Galilee, learning patience, observation, and of course teamwork. Qualities really that would serve him well in his apostolic ministry. He first followed John the Baptist. See, when Jesus called him, Andrew responded immediately. But he didn't stop there. He sought out his brother Simon, John chapter 1 and verse 41. We read, he first found his brother Simon and told him, "We have found the Messiah," which is translated as Christ. Andrew's calling illustrates a vital truth. Discipleship is relational, and faith really spreads through personal connection. He appears at sort of key moments in Jesus' ministry, often quietly facilitating. He brings Greeks to Jesus at the feast of the Passover, John chapter 12 and verses 20 through to 22. He participates in the feeding of the 5,000, John chapter 6, 8 and 9. See, though not as prominent in speeches as Peter or John, he demonstrates that discipleship is not only about preaching, but also about enabling others to encounter Christ. And after Pentecost, Andrew's missionary zeal, well, it carried him far from Galilee. See, according to early church tradition, he preached in Scythia, in Byzantium, and Achaia. And Eusebius and later writers such as Origen attest to his presence in these regions where he established Christian communities along the Black Sea and in Greece. The Acts of Andrew, a non-canonical text again, portrays him performing miracles, converting pagans, and boldly confronting rulers. Though the sort of historicity of some of these episodes is debated among scholars, these stories do reflect the early community's memory of Andrew as a courageous and determined evangelist. He is traditionally said to have been martyred in Patras, Achaia, bound to an X-shaped cross, the St. Andrew's cross, which many of us are familiar with, especially in Scotland. See, his legacy resonates throughout both Eastern Orthodoxy and the Western Christendom. His life really teaches that faithful initiative, the willingness to act and bring others to Christ, is as vital as preaching or teaching. He shows that being first called carries responsibility to lead with humility and dedication. See, Andrew was relational. He was courageous and proactive. He listened intently, discerned wisely, and then acted decisively. And his quiet leadership often went unnoticed, yet his influence was so profound. He reminds us that the discipleship thrives in both public action and, of course, private devotion. So from Galilee to the Black Sea, even to Scotland, Andrew's footsteps trace a path of commitment and courage. He connects people to Christ, not by spectacle, but by faithful service and a heart which is attuned to God's will. So from Andrew now, we turn to Matthias, chosen to restore the 12 after Judas's betrayal. The 12 were incomplete, and into this gap stepped Matthias, chosen by casting lots to restore the number of apostles back to 12, Acts 1:15 through to 26. Now Luke, in Acts 1 and verse 21 and 22, records that the criteria for his selections were experience and faithfulness, one who had been a witness to all that Jesus did. He was chosen not for fame, but for steadfastness, a disciple who walked with Jesus from baptism to ascension. And after his appointment, early church writings suggest Matthias spread the gospel into Judea, into Cappadocia, and along the Caspian region. So details may be sparse and often entwined with legend, but the Acts of Andrew and Matthias, another non-canonical text, preserve tales really of his missionary work, miracles, and of course his steadfast witness. See, these writings, while not part of the biblical canon, reflect early communities' memory of Matthias, really as a man of courage and faith, chosen by God to complete the circle of 12. His life teaches that God calls the prepared and faithful, even if their story is largely hidden. Matthias shows that impact is not measured by recognition, but by steadfast service. And tradition holds that Matthias was indeed martyred for his faith, though accounts really do vary. Some say he was stoned, others beheaded. However, in each version, his death underscores obedience and courage, the very hallmarks really of his character. So, from Philip's bridging work, Bartholomew's honesty and courage, Andrew's initiative, to Matthias's quiet faithfulness, these four apostles illuminate different dimensions of discipleship. They really remind us that the gospel spread not through a single type of personality, but through a sort of mosaic of faithful lives. Each contributing in unique ways to the unfolding story of Jesus. Now, in the next video of this series, we will examine Paul, known as the Apostle to the nations. But how outstanding is this title that's attributed to him? See, in view of what we have just been uncovering with the 12, which we've been discussing, Paul, a figurehead whose life and mission really marked a critical turning point in the spread of the message of Jesus Christ. It brings us to really a fork in the road of the way Jesus taught, and as exemplified by James and the other apostles. And we'll see why in the next video. So until then, as always, thank you so very much and look forward to seeing you again shortly. Thank you.